Because I said so. Because I said so. This phrase is likely familiar to folks who are parents or grandparents or work with children, or familiar if you ever were parented. It is a common exertion of parental authority to offer that phrase, usually in response to the question, why? Or why not? From the child, and the adult responds, because I said so. And I'm thinking about this because we're on a Sunday in between Mother's Day and Father's Day. And thinking about, for myself as a child, I did not find that to be a satisfactory answer. And there's probably a whole generation raised hearing those words who then said, well, I'm not going to say that to my child. And I remember this one experience where I was in a grocery store, and there was a father with about a 3-year-old daughter in the grocery cart, and they're moving through the aisle, and the little girl, something catches her eye. She says, I want that, Daddy, I want that, Daddy. And he said, not today, sweetheart. And then she, though, called out again, I want the treat, I want the treat. Oh, no, sweetheart. And then she said, why? And I was ready for the, because I said so. But that's not what he did. This father said, well, sweetheart, Mommy and Daddy don't want you to have refined sugars and preservatives, and we want you to develop healthy eating patterns. And he said it with this tone that seemed to indicate he believed that his 3-year-old would rationally consider the evidence and then would concede. But it didn't work that way. She just bellowed out again, I want it! And I thought to myself, this father doesn't really seem to understand his authority as a parent in this situation. And I was thinking about authority for lots of reasons, but I recognize we have different relationships with authority or understandings of authority. That has a lot to do with our own life experience, perhaps which generations we grew up in. So for example, and I know I'm generalizing a bit, but there's some people who grew up in a world with this idea of you did things because they were expected. You took your hat off when you came indoors. If a flag went by down the street, you put your hand over your heart. You didn't ask why or if this was reasonable, or you just did it. It was what was expected. And then there are others who grew up in a world, some of you post Little Rock and Kent State and Vietnam. And then there was more of asking, well, why? Why should I do what this authority says? And is that authority really having the best desires for the greater good? And then there are other people, their sense of authority is, well, their own opinion or feeling. And so we're hearing a lot these days about people who say things like, well, I don't care what almost every scientist in the world says. I'm not wearing a mask because I don't think this is real. So what kind of relationship with authority do you have? Where might you fit in the spectrum? I recognize that most of us would agree that some kind of authority is useful and that we give in to certain authority, like most of us stop at red lights. Most of us put on our seatbelts. But overall, there is healthy suspicion of authority and questioning authority. And I recognize it's because so often authority has been misused and abused. And we are seeing it in spades in the world right now. And I'm just naming some that I know probably everyone's heard about, seen visuals of. But that white police officer in Minneapolis, kneeling on George Floyd's neck, being filmed in public, and believed he had the authority to do that with impunity. Choked the life out of the man while he called out, I can't breathe. He called for his mama. And this man, this police officer, believed he had the authority over this man to do that thing. Or I think about a place I had been many times as my son went to school in Washington, D.C., Lafayette Park. And you've been hearing about Lafayette Park. And I'll tell you, every day there's someone protesting something there. I mean, it's just, that's part of the culture of this space in front of the White House. And I heard the reports from colleagues, clergy who were there, about how there was a peaceful protest going on in that moment earlier this week, and then how there were canisters lobbed into the crowd, and shields and militarized officers moving the crowd out of the way with their eyes burning, and they were having trouble breathing. And that even the priest of St. John's Church and a seminarian distributing water and granola bars forced out of their own church property. I mean, imagine, we sometimes have had these prayer services at our peace pole. Imagine Pastor John and me and some of you gathered there, and suddenly there's canisters with burning gases lobbed into our midst, and armed forces that push us off our own property so some politician could have a photo op in front of our building, awkwardly holding a Bible? I mean, that's crazy. What an abuse of authority, let alone the misunderstanding of the symbols. So of course we have suspicion of authority. And of course it's also not a new thing. So those are just the recent headlines. But it goes back in ancient history. Whether priests, popes, presidents, politicians, and everyday people who have used and misused and abused authority to get more money or power, to hold other people back or other people down. So authority, understandably, has a bad reputation. And I'm talking about authority because it's showing up in our scripture readings today. And it raises questions and issues. But authority in and of itself, I just want to offer this idea, if you just think about what the word means, it's to have charge over something. And that's neither bad nor good, it just is. And I find it helpful, and so I share with you that the word authority, etymologically, and it's also easy to see, has at its center the word author. That we can think of authority as the power given to form and shape a story, to tell a story, to live into a story. And that can be blessing or it can be curse, depending on how it's used. So in the readings today, you heard language, and the English translations vary, but language from Genesis and from the Psalm that says that we are to have authority over the created world, and that we are to co-author with God. And we hear Jesus in his final message in person with his disciples in Matthew's version of the story, where he says all authority in the cosmos has been given to him. And that essentially what he's doing is he's passing it on as his disciples are immersed in the fullness of God, that they will have that same authority. So what is this about? Well, I think about in the Hebrew scriptures this idea that goes back to the creation story, where God, we know God speaks, or we might think of God sings a song, and it brings creation into being. That God's telling a story. And this is the beginning of creation. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, God said. So God's telling a story of creating out of chaos, of filling the emptiness, of bringing brightness into the void. And God tells a story that's bright and beautiful and diverse and diversifying, that's abundant and full and joyful. It's this beautiful dance imagery throughout the first chapter of Genesis. And God looks at God's story coming alive, and God says, ooh, that's good. And then as the story continues about God's story of creation, we hear that there's human beings formed in the very image of God. And part of what it seems the story is wanting us to know, that being in the image of God, is that God wants co-creators or co-authors of the story. And the idea is that we are to be attuned to God's story, to be listening for God's song, and then we join in. And that as we do so, we are multiplying and magnifying the life, the creativity, the goodness. And God says that story is very good. And part of, though, how God's story works, how God's authority works, God's authoring, is it's not coercive. That God does not force those humans in God's image to be automatons that listen for God's story and speak it and live it. The humans can choose. There is freedom in this dynamic with the divine. And as the story unfolds and our own experience tells us, humans do a lot of saying, no thanks. I don't want to listen to this story. I'm not so interested anymore in that song. But what the story reveals, and likely our experience tells us as well, is that though disconnected from the story of creativity, of an abundance, of connection and communion and love, well then we feel in some ways, whether consciously or not, that we're on our own. It's all up to us. And then we tend to operate out of places of fear and scarcity. And that's the story we tell ourselves, and that's the story we start telling the world, and then that's the story we live. And by the way, God in the story never takes away the authoring, the authority. So whether for blessing or curse, we still have this power to form and shape the story. And so then what starts to happen is that humans in a story of disconnection, alienation, fear, and scarcity start authoring story of all those things. And we get things like not loving the neighbor's now a threat. And we develop enemies. And whoever looks different becomes other and should be walled off or separated from us. And that instead of loving and nurturing the fullness of the creation, we misuse it and abuse it and pollute it and choke off the air. We can't breathe. That's what we do in disconnection from God's story. And so this great gift, God keeps on speaking. God keeps on singing. God never withdraws the story. And there are people who tune in, prophets and priestesses and so many over the centuries and years and around the world. And we remember the story of Jesus, who gets it, who listens for God's story, and who then doesn't just sing the song or tell it, but he says, come on in with me and live it. Live this story. And we see how Jesus, this always hits me, and you'll hear me say it again, how Jesus needs to keep listening for God's story. Jesus immerses himself in the scriptures. As John was holding up, he understands it's a living word. The scriptures, the scrolls, the stories that challenge and stretch, and there's some things about it we're like, that doesn't work very well, but it's the story of other people's relationship with God and each other, and it's worth digging into and wrestling with in community. That Jesus makes it a practice to worship together with others, to hear the songs and the prayers and to know the voices and the melodies. And that Jesus prays a lot. And Jesus' prayer is not like just, God's the vending machine in the sky and Jesus is pushing the right buttons to get out the prize. His prayer is a lot of listening. It's long prayer. Early in the morning, all night long, prayer alone, prayer in community. Jesus prays a lot, and it always is interesting to me, and I'm putting myself in this category, how often those of us who say we follow him think that we can get away with less prayer than Jesus. That we don't even need to talk to God so much or pay attention to the stories. Jesus needed it, and he teaches us to tune in to listen to the story that God is telling. And as we do, to connect with God's breath, God's spirit, to be baptized, as he says in the story. Baptize means immerse. To be immersed in the spirit and story of God so that we have the authority, that we author God's goodness, love, justice, and mercy in the world. It's the movement that Jesus starts and the one that we're called to be a part of even here and even now. I was thinking a lot this week about the story I heard and for a time told myself and would have lived into with others about race. And it's a mixed bag story. I was explicitly taught, and I'm so thankful, by my mother and my grandmothers, that everyone is created equal. That they wanted me to understand, even as a young child, that color of skin was not to determine my treatment of someone, or that white was better than black or brown. And in my Sunday school, and I cringe a little bit at the language, now, but we sang that song, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. And we're being taught that we're all one and it doesn't matter, etc. At the same time, there are other people in my family who use the N-word. At the same time, in my elementary school, I grew up in a racially diverse city, but in completely segregated neighborhoods with segregated elementary schools. Almost all the kids in my school were white. And we moved to a suburb by the time I'm in high school, and almost everyone around me is white. And then there are some African American students, but I remember the story we were being told about how, there's apparently more poverty among people of color, but the students in our high school are like the Cosby kids. Middle class and from professional families. And then we sang songs about Martin Luther King and learned about civil rights. So the story that I'll say I believed, because I wanted it to be true, is this whole race thing. We took care of it. Y'all, the generation before me, well done. You did your work, we've got the laws, and now we're all equal. And then I grew up and saw that's not the truth, and that's not the case. But in the face of that, I felt powerless, and I wasn't sure what to do. And so, like many white folk, I lived in my own sense of denial. I told myself a story of, well, at least there's been improvement, and we can kind of rest on that and that sort of thing. But the longer I followed Jesus, the more I hear God's story and God's song of justice and turning old orders upside down. And that's hard, and it's transformational, and it's way easier to live in denial. But I heard a story and felt a story that called me into action. And it's action that I'll say is painfully slow. It's action where I learned to develop real relationships with people who had different life experience and racial backgrounds than me, and forming friendships and learning how to listen. And how to, in terms of action and what to do, listening for the people who are in the places of pain or in the communities that are oppressed, and listening for how God's speaking through what they're saying, please do this, or please walk with us, or please stay out of it. But whatever, listening in those relationships. And learning to take action in terms of it matters who our leaders are, and we can vote. It matters what our laws say, and we can dismantle some of the ones that keep institutional racism and oppression in place. And learning to speak up, even that playful, supposedly harmless joke, to call it out, because there's evil in that, and damage and pain is done by that. And all of that, I know right now I've been hearing from people, what can we do, what can we do? And part of our American story is there should be a quick fix. There should be the fast food version of how to move forward and make it better, and there's not. That arc of justice, it bends slowly. But we are only part of it as we keep listening for God's story, in the cries of the pain, hurt people, in the words of the scriptures and the prophets and the stories of Jesus, in the times that we set aside to listen for how God is still speaking, individually and in community, and then taking the risk to lean into that story, to tell that story, to live that story. We have authority. We are authors. And it's up to us each day which stories we most pay attention to, which stories we tell, and which stories we live. Jesus shows us a way where we live into the truth that we are co-authors with God of creativity, justice, healing, and hope. Cassis Adobis, let that be our story. Amen.